First, welcome to the Global Federation of Councils on Competitiveness. This session is being viewed by our members in over 25 countries. And we are so pleased that your government has hosted us this time. We wanted to be in person. We're going to come back next year in person if you'll have us again. But it's really important to us, and you've been strong members of the Federation, which is about building partnerships and cooperations around the world. There's so many win-win solutions, and that's what we're focused on. We've all been focused on COVID-19, and I've been very impressed with the steps your government has taken. But could you elaborate more on the steps you've taken and how you see the pathway out of this situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, hello, and it's a pleasure to join you. Look, COVID-19 is clearly an issue that has affected us within Australia, but it's a global issue. In Australia, we have been very clear that this is a health and an economic crisis. So we have been doing our best to deal with both of those. So if I just touch briefly on the health focus, I mean, clearly we took action to secure our borders very early. In probably February of this year, we actually took quite strong action to make sure that that we were limiting the spread of COVID across Australia. We have been largely successful with that so far. We went through the stage of preparing for what we might have experienced in terms of making sure that we had appropriate medical stocks and supplies of the essential medical equipment, and particularly personal protective equipment. And that meant that we needed to do a number of things, which was to look at what we could do to secure our supply in from overseas, but also ramp up our manufacturing here in Australia. We also looked at capacity for medicines, whether they be potential treatments for COVID-19 or how supply chains may well be impacting on our pharmaceuticals and our medical supply. We do have very good stock levels that we hold in Australia of medicines, but we needed to make sure that we were doing all that we could to secure our supply chains with that. From an economic perspective, we have provided the support that we can to businesses and to individuals who were affected through job losses, businesses that have been enormously affected, and of course there are some industries that have been significantly disrupted. Clearly education, but our tourism hospitality has been very seriously affected, and there are others. So we looked at what we could do to support those businesses, but to position them for the recovery. And that's probably the point that we are at the moment, that we are looking at what are the steps that we now need to take for our long-term recovery here in Australia.
Well, that sounds very promising. And you think we're at a turning point? Maybe early next year we might be starting to build back?
Well, I think we've got to aim for that being an appropriate time frame. Look, clearly we don't know. We haven't experienced this situation before. There have been multiple waves in other nations as well. So we're preparing for that recovery, to be honest, now. From a tourism point of view, the December-January period is actually quite critical for us in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere. That's our Northern Holiday time as well. We're looking at what we can to stimulate and support tourism within Australia, given that international travel is so difficult for everyone at the moment. And we're really starting that recovery process now, but realistically, work is underway in terms of various treatments, work is underway in respect of vaccines, and they all feed in to what our recovery processes are going to be.
See, I know manufacturing is very much a part of your strategy. I was studying your work, and you've got 6 areas you focused on. They were quite a unique set of areas. I think a lot of work from your team must have gone into that. Could you elaborate some on that?
Absolutely. Well, manufacturing is a very important part of our recovery. Now, work was already underway about 18 months ago to look at what the future of manufacturing was going to be in Australia. And as the Minister responsible, I was always of the view that we needed to play to our strengths, that we couldn't continue to try and be all things to all people, because ultimately we were just spreading our resources too thin and probably not maximising the opportunities. So we started looking at where our priorities were, where our strengths were, about 18 months ago. Of course, with COVID, we've had to put the COVID lens over the work that we were doing to see whether or not there were any gaps, and there are, which I'm happy to come back to and talk about in terms of what we're now calling the supply chain resilience initiative. But when you look at what Australia has either got a competitive or a comparative advantage in, and look at what we need to do to build capacity in some strategic areas, it started to become very clear. We did have, and we do have, comparative and competitive strengths in resources, but from a manufacturing point of view, as you start to break that down, it is in resources technology and critical minerals processing. When we actually started to look at the other areas, we do have manufacturing strengths in food and beverage, and there are some enormous opportunities for us to build on that capacity now. We do have abundant food in Australia. We actually have at least 3 times as much food as we can consume here. So we have opportunities to significantly grow our export opportunities, but look at how we process foods, particularly for our northern neighbours who are looking at what we can do with processed legumes, vegetarian foods. So food and beverage is a key issue. Recycling and clean energy. The Prime Minister was very clear that we were going to make sure that we were recycling our own waste here. I've taken the view that from a recycling point of view, what do we need to look at in terms of building an industry around recycling? How are we going to recycle and produce more materials that in turn can be used as the raw materials again for the different products? And of course, clean energy is a key part of that. There's a lot of synergies with recycling. And as you start to bring in the resources technology, critical minerals processing, you start to come into clean energy with batteries. And there's, whilst we've actually identified the priorities, there are some clear connections between those priorities. Medical products, it's clear that we have been able to demonstrate strengths. And if you look at what our capacity was during the height in Australia of the COVID crisis, we were able to increase our capacity to manufacture the likes of surgical masks, but where we excelled was at the high end, to be able to pivot our manufacturers to produce ventilators, to look at how we were going to convert non-invasive ventilators to invasive ventilators. So medical products is clearly a priority for us. And again, we will look at within medical products where our priority areas are. And the two other areas that we need to make sure that we're looking at are defence and space. So we are ideally located in the southern hemisphere for space, so we have a couple of natural advantages in there, but global positioning is something that's very important to us. And of course, we're working with NASA on their Artemis program so that we can link our businesses into the supply chains, but in key priority areas for NASA, which is probably the remote autonomous operations.
Oh, that's a great summary and very exciting areas. This is a large contrast from when I was visiting your country frequently 20 years ago. You've really opened up your horizons in a very, I'd say, a new edge technology way. You mentioned earlier the supply chain resilience. That's so important to every one of the countries that are looking in today. Could you say more about what you've done?
Yes, so we identified that there were some critical issues for us. And I should caveat everything that I'm saying on the basis that we are a trading nation and will always be a trading nation. What we need to do, though, is look at what we have to have the capacity to either manufacture or secure in times of a crisis. So what we've identified is that there were some things, particularly along the personal protective equipment lines, that we hadn't been manufacturing here in Australia. That meant that we were very dependent on bringing that product in for overseas. That can't continue, and we've already taken steps to make sure that we have capacity. We're going through a process now where we will look at what all those gaps are and whether we will look to meet those needs from within Australia or to secure supply chains. Now, transport was a significant issue for us. We are an island continent in the southern hemisphere. Freight became an issue, how we were going to get our product in. So we're going to be looking at how we can secure very strong supply chains, but diversify our supply chains so that in times of crisis, we can secure as well as we can to bring into our country the goods that we need, that we have made a conscious decision that we're probably not going to be manufacturing and producing here in Australia.
It seems like a very comprehensive approach. When I'm not working with the Global Federation, I chair the board of Shell. And I couldn't let this opportunity go by without thanking you for your great hospitality. So we have many operations there with natural gas. We're able to ship around the world to be very supportive. And we even have a new project on hydrogen, where we're ultimately building a ship with Japan that we can be able to export hydrogen farther north. So I just want to thank you for your great cooperation.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Please go ahead.
No, now that you've mentioned hydrogen, well, you actually also reminded me that many years ago I did work with one of Shell's competitors. Esso was their plant maintenance engineer, so it's very happy memories from those.
Well, I see you're a mechanical engineer, so I am really glad to see a mechanical engineer in your role. So you know how to get things done. That's very helpful. So that's great.
Do my best.
Yeah. So I think we're all, as individuals and families and countries, reflecting back on lessons learned from COVID. I know it's still early in the process, but do you have any early learnings from your perspective?
Look, the standout, quite frankly, is the diversification of supply chains. So to make sure that in future we have diversification of that we have, I guess, to use a petroleum analogy, the upstream and the downstream supply chains absolutely in place. So that's the first step that we are taking here in Australia to make sure that it is supply chains and it's the supply chain resilience, because we have learnt so much in terms of the difficulties that we encountered in securing those supply chains. Now, look, we don't know what the next issue is going to be. No one knows what that next issue will be. So all we can do is put in place some mechanisms to deal with what some likely scenarios may well be if we have another health crisis. How do we make sure that we can secure what we need to support our population here in Australia? And then, of course, we will turn our minds to the likes of our nearest neighbours, particularly in the Pacific region, as to how we would then be able to support them.
Oh, that's great. Well, this is a really important time where we're all looking for this vaccine and see how effective it'll be. I guess in the last few days, we've had some encouraging reports about one of the products, but it's still early. But I think that'll be important to all of us, and then as a world, figure out how to get that distributed to people as we move forward. When you look at this manufacturing strategy, if you could go back to that just a little bit more, what do you think? You have to make budgetary decisions as a country, and it looks like you've put significant amount of funds toward research and to support these new manufacturing strategies. Has that been difficult decision to make as a government?
Look, I wouldn't say it's a difficult decision, but it was a lengthy decision, and there was a lot of rigour, as you would expect, to be applied to how we were going to develop the strategy, but then how we were going to roll out that strategy. So what we've done with our manufacturing strategy is focus on competitiveness, resilience, and scale. And scale is probably the key part of our manufacturing strategy in terms of jobs for the future. So there's a clear jobs focus in what we have done. Now, research is a part of it, and if I break it down, there's if I put the supply chain resilience piece to the side, there's really three key parts of our manufacturing strategy. The first one is to build scale. So we're not looking at supporting individual businesses. This is where we're looking for a consortium, so that we're looking at how businesses are going to work together. So we've long talked here in Australia and quite frankly internationally about the need to be industry researcher collaboration. So that piece has been looked at, but we believe that the missing part here in Australia is the business to business collaboration. So we need our businesses looking at how they can support each other, how they can build the scale in manufacturing that we need. So that's probably the key piece within the strategy. We also are focusing not so much on the industry research collaboration, but making sure we're looking at commercialisation of good ideas. So how do we take that research that is being done at our universities or CSIRO, which is our leading science agency? How do we actually take that and commercialise it and turn it into scale? So that's important. And the third stream is how we support Australian businesses to become part of international supply chains. And I think I've touched on the opportunity that we have with NASA and the Artemis program, or we're also looking for other opportunities for us to be part of the supply chains for other nations as well. So we'll be working very closely with other nations to determine what they need that we can fulfill, so that we can work hand in hand with them.
That is very comprehensive. CSRO has a tremendous reputation for working with industry. From my experience, one of the best in the world. I think you should be very proud of that. I'm so glad to see you going beyond the original model and particularly focusing on businesses working together, business to business, and the clusters that creates. I think some other countries are missing that. I hope some of our other members will take advantage of that and learn from that during our sessions this week in what we're doing. It's really important. It wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about digital, because digital is everywhere, in every place. And how do you keep the priorities right to keep digital moving forward? At the same time, we need jobs for people. It's always a dichotomy about what the right pace and type of digital transformation is.
So we've started from the announcement that our Prime Minister made about a year ago to say that by 2030 he wanted Australia to be a leading digital nation. And I'm absolutely supportive of that announcement that he made. Now, I think what we've got to do is make sure that we bring the population with us on the digital journey. It is a cause of great optimism for many businesses and for many individuals, but there's also a proportion of the population that sees, if we look at autonomous operations, if we look at automation in particular, that equates to job losses for them. Now, there's a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that we communicate properly that the digital economy is not something that should be a threat, it is actually an opportunity for us. Now, as part of our manufacturing strategy, there is a component that actually looks at, we're calling it manufacturing modernisation. So it's actually how we bring our manufacturing businesses well into the current century, and digital is going to be a key part of that. So we will use manufacturing to promote that, but it's clearly not the only part of the work that we need to be looking at. We are looking at how we can really take charge of the digital economy here in Australia, how we can grow that, how we can start the transition into a full-scale digital economy by 2030. So it clearly is a work in progress. I'm very keen to work with other nations. I have been part of various discussions, and I think that in fairness, everyone accepts that we need to work towards a digital economy. I'm not sure that we're at a position where we can start pressing the button on this is actually how we're going to achieve that. I think we're at the stages of planning and understanding what the digital economy means and how we can break that down into a plan, into a program to take us towards 2030. So I've never been one to want to reinvent the wheel, so I'm very happy to take on board what is happening in other nations, look at that and see how we can use that in Australia, and also to share our experiences.
Oh, that's great. So I guess skills development in people will be an important part of that. So they have the right skills, not only to operate in the digital economy, but also make it happen, make the devices happen and keep them operational.
Absolutely. And like many other nations, we have struggled to get our young kids, our young people, to look at developing skills in the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering and maths. And I think actually digital is providing us with an opportunity to actually change that focus a little bit, because disappointingly, young people don't really care about the fact that 75% of the jobs of the future are going to require STEM skills. That's not attracting them to go and study those subjects. So they're really good at the digital work, and they do that without even thinking. They use smartphones, they use a whole range of very digital technologies, and they probably don't realise that they are already part of our digital economy. And if we can use that level of excitement to say, well, here are where the jobs are, and importantly, to engage their parents so that they see that it's not just their kids, playing games on whatever electronic device they have in front of them, that there is actually a future through that digital pathway. We're going to address not only how we're going to develop our economy, but how we're going to resource that through the skills, because we are not getting sufficient take-up of study in the areas that we know we have already a skills deficit.
It seems like a very good approach because they're all using these devices. If they can see, they can take their knowledge and desire around that. It's going to be very useful in the future. And so but you have to aim it, because if you don't add to just playing games, it won't be enough. If I could ask you a personal question, what inspired you to go into engineering? Well, you took a STEM field, and what moved you in that direction?
Well, I always liked maths, and was probably more maths than science for me, although I obviously did science subjects as well, so it was maths. And I guess maths has an answer. You actually can do it. Yes, you can solve an equation, you can solve a problem, and you get an answer. So I liked the black and white nature of maths quite frankly. And then when I got towards the end of my schooling and we started to look at options, I had a serious look at engineering, and I thought, that would be good, because that is all about solving problems, building stuff, making stuff, how exciting is that? And I guess I had to be proactive, and it was because, to be honest, a couple of the other boys in my class were encouraged to do engineering, and I thought, well, what's engineering all about? So I had a serious look at engineering, and I thought, that would be pretty good. And even though I'm not working as an engineer now, I use the skills I developed as an engineer every single day. Everything is a project to me. It has a start and a finish, and I work out how I'm going to get to the end of it. And I actually think engineering is a very, very good qualification for people to learn how to think properly, and to use those skills, whether they're working hands-on as an engineer or whether they use those skills to develop elsewhere. But it was maths. Maths was the start.
Well, that's wonderful. And I think that's true for so many people, because if you don't have those mathematical skills, it's very difficult. But I really like you sharing the story about how this has been useful to you in the many other roles you've had. So you don't have to work as an engineer every day to apply the skills. I think that's what some students miss. They think they're limited to what they can do. But how did you make the transition from engineering to a minister? That seems like a pretty big leap. I know there's a lot of things along the way.
Yeah, so I started working as an engineer, and I was working in the oil industry, and I had to supervise people, and they don't teach engineers how to relate to people generally. So I was supervising people and the oil industry from an industrial relations point of view. Can be, I guess, very volatile to use that word. So I had to learn very quickly about the Australian industrial relations system and how to supervise other people to get the work that was needed to be done actually done. And I found I really liked industrial relations. So I worked as an industrial advocate for a number of years, and I really enjoyed being an advocate. I just felt that there were some people out there that didn't have a voice, and that's what interested me in politics. But after I became the member for my electorate, which is Macpherson on the Gold Coast, I was able to again use my engineering skills. I joined one of the committees that we have in Parliament, the Public Works Committee. So I was pretty much in heaven, being able to look at what we were doing, particularly from an infrastructure point of view here. So that's why I say everything that I learned, even back at school, has taken me through my engineering, through industrial relations, and through into politics.
But I think look at your ministry now, focusing on science and technology and industry, it's perfect to have that background, both the relations background as well as the core engineering background. It seems to me you've had the right career path to be trained for this position and hopefully many more positions in the future as it goes forward.
Well, I think I'm very lucky. It's a great portfolio.
That's great. Well, but before we run out of time, is there anything else you'd like to share with the members of the Global Federation about you or your country?
No, so bear with me. I'm actually going to have to go because the bells are ringing and I'm required in the chamber. But
thank you very much.
Yeah,
please go. Take care. I really enjoyed it.